The 1970 novel Zettel's Traum by Arno Schmidt is full of different literary experiments, one of which is the inventive use of typography and punctuation. This presentation focuses on two types of punctuation found in Zettel's Traum, that which has rhythmic and musical meanings, and that which represents the act of drawing. Here are the two main categories, rhythm and drawing. In each category, I give several examples, two of which are illustrated here. The first is from a recitation of a German translation of the 1844 Edgar Allan Poe poem Dreamland. The second is a drawing that the main character Dan makes in the sand. In Book 7 of Zettel's Traum, Dan recites his German translation of Poe's Dreamland. The text swells across the page from left margin to right margin, and a dash dot punctuation motif occurs 3 times. The dash dot works rhythmically in several ways. In the first place, it functions as a tempo. Dan says the title of the poem and then beats one bar before beginning his recitation of it. Conductors do this sometimes so that the ensemble knows the tempo in advance of the first entrance. Dancers count 5, 6, 7, 8 before they begin. There's a recording of Schmidt reading this passage out loud in which you can hear him pause between stanzas. Using that recording, you might even be able to measure the tempo of the recitation and assign a time signature to the punctuation. Beyond that, the punctuation looks like musical notation. The parentheses look like the bars of a measure. The dashes look like flattened, dotted whole notes, as well as the marking for tenuto, the opposite of staccato, indicating that the note should be held its full value. I'll read part of the passage now and snap my fingers in time. Im Reiche der Neid, ja? Rasen, wo im finstern Leeren kranke Engel nur verkehren, und ein Eidolon die Nacht hoch auf schwarzem Throne wacht, führten jüngst mich in dies Land her, von Ultima Thule Strand her. Und sein Dämmersaum, wild wie Hexentraum, jenseits von Zeit, jenseits von Raum. Bodenlos Talgewind und Spalt, Geflüte, Höhl, Titanenwald. In addition to functioning as a way to set the tempo, the dash dot also refers to the structure of the poem and its variations in different publications. In the block of text on page 1099, the dash dot unit occurs 3 times. Once before the beginning of the poem, once after its first stanza, and once during its penultimate stanza break. The last iteration is missing the final dash that the first 2 identical units share. The dash dot occurs during structural breaks in the poem on the page, and it also refers to the poem's overall chorus-verse structure. In other words, the dash dot, dash dot, dash dot, dash is the chorus verse, chorus verse, chorus verse, chorus of Poe's 1844 publication of the poem in Graham's magazine. The fact that the punctuation unit loses 1 dash in its last iteration alludes to the variation in number of choruses that are included in successive publications of the poem. Schmidt uses this dash dot formulation elsewhere in Zettel's Traum, but not often. Another example is page 313, the last page of Book 2. If we imagine in Book 7 that the dash dot is the conductor giving the orchestra 1 bar for free at the beginning of a poem, on the last page of Book 2 it looks more like the conductor holding the cutoff in a ringingly silent hall after the fade of the final note of the piece. Like the conductor's fists in the air, Book Two's finale says to pay attention to the silence after the last note, that the tempo continues for a moment in the silence after the piece is completed. Here, the motif is unbounded by parenthetical bar lines. The asterism then concludes the chapter like a curtain coming down. The final word, bitte or please, is a bit of typographic misbehavior. If Schmidt is using the asterism as a section break, in addition to having the chapter end, then it would be incorrect to include a line after that, ostensibly its own section that actually concludes the chapter. The dash dot punctuation is not an invention of Zettel's Traum, but rather something that Schmidt had been developing at least since the mid-50s. In the short novella Tina from 1955-56, Schmidt deploys the same formulation. Here it represents the narrator getting into an elevator and ascending 5 floors. 1 dash and 1 dot per floor. The elevator opens, the attendant says, "Here you are." The narrator replies, "Thank you," and then strides off the elevator in a fashion that is represented by a slight variation of the dash dot motif. Here we have dash comma, dash comma, dash comma. This usage of the dash dot formulation in Tina and its variation with the comma show that Schmidt is using punctuation like a language. The punctuation marks are the letters. They spell words that often have multiple and abstract meanings. And in this case, the abstraction is the beat, pulse, or tempo of something happening, like counting off a poetic recitation or experiencing an elevator ascend. The words form a vocabulary with a grammar that is at times susceptible to intuition, at times inscrutable. Unlike a language, of course, this system of signs is invented and controlled by one person who has the power to develop it in any direction at whim. Turning now from rhythmic punctuation to the punctuation of drawing. From time to time, throughout the novel, Dan draws something in the sand or on a slip of paper. Here, in Book 2, he is drawing a rebus, which is a puzzle or riddle of images that disguises words or phrases. Here, the punctuation shows Dan writing out the puzzle, word by word. The game here is to read from the bottom to the top, inserting the word sous between the pairs. The result is the sentence, "Un soupir vient souvent d'un souvenir." A sigh often comes from a memory. This punctuation has a double meaning. It is clearly a depiction of Dan writing the word pairs in the sand, but it's also a depiction of the syllables of the completed phrase. The dash dash semicolon dash dash semicolon dash dash period dash are the 10 syllables of the line broken into groupings of 3, 3, and 4, as if Dan has the lilt of the lyric in mind while drawing the undeciphered rebus. By the way, Schmidt has used the Encyclopedia Britannica to find examples of rebuses. There are 2 examples from the entry for rebus that wind up on the page 193, on page 193 of Zettel's Traum. You can pause the video now if you'd like to read the full encyclopedia entry. Another example of punctuation as drawing is Dan sketching the world's first panorama on a notepad so that his companions can see what he's talking about. In the original, Schmidt has actually got a note to himself to insert a picture of a panorama from the Larousse Encyclopedia. His punctuation traces the contours and symmetry of the final drawing. Here are the two examples of the punctuation of drawing, the rebus and the panorama. In these cases, it's clear that the punctuation is meant to refer to the act of drawing. With Schmidt, sometimes the context gives you good clues about the punctuation's meaning. Other times, however, the punctuation is difficult and any deciphering remains speculative. Analyzing how Schmidt uses punctuation to represent elements of rhythm and drawing only scratches the surface of his typographic experiments in Zettel's Traum. The four characters walk, talk, think, and engage in and observe many activities that are described by punctuation. By scrutinizing particular formulations and their plausible interpretations, we might pick up something of the language of Schmidt's experimental typography.